The evening of March 22nd, 1945. Nierstein, Germany. 366 metres of Rhine River stretched before Lieutenant Robert Schillato of the 249th Engineer Combat Battalion, its dark waters flowing at 7 miles per hour toward the North Sea, carrying with it the last natural barrier between the American Third Army and the heart of the Third Reich. Above him, a quarter moon provided just enough light to silhouette the far bank, where German positions remained ominously quiet. Behind him, 300 combat engineers crouched beside their trucks, each man knowing that in the next 18 hours, they would either build a bridge capable of carrying 40-ton Sherman tanks across one of Europe's most formidable rivers, or they would die trying. The engineers had been preparing for this moment since February. They had trained on the Saar River, assembling and disassembling M2 treadway bridge sections until they could work by touch alone. They had studied the Rhine's current speed, its depth, its temperamental nature. They knew that Field Marshal Bernard Montgomery's 21st Army Group was scheduled to cross the Rhine the following night, with an operation involving over 1 million troops, 5,000 artillery pieces, and the largest airborne assault since Normandy. And they knew that General George Patton wanted to beat Montgomery across, not for glory, though Patton never shied from that, but because every hour the war continued, more men died. Every day Germany held out, more cities burned. The Rhine was the last barrier. Cross it, and Germany's defeat became inevitable. Fail to cross it, and the war would drag on through spring, through summer, perhaps into another winter of killing. What these engineers did not know, standing in the darkness on March 22nd, was that their 18-hour bridge construction would shorten World War II by months, enable the capture of over 60,000 German Feldbars, prisoners in a single week, and demonstrate an engineering capability that would fundamentally alter how modern armies thought about river crossings. They did not know that 72 years later, a monument would stand on this exact spot, commemorating the moment when ordinary soldiers accomplished something military planners had declared nearly impossible. They knew only that they had a job to do, and that General Patton was depending on them to do it faster than anyone thought possible. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. 7 months earlier, August 1944, the 249th Engineer Combat Battalion had landed on Utah Beach. The unit had been constituted just 16 months prior at Camp Bowie, Texas, commanded by 3 captains and staffed with second lieutenants fresh from the West Point class of 1943. They were young men, most barely into their 20s, who had grown up during the Depression and volunteered for the most dangerous job in the Army. Combat engineers were expected to build bridges under fire, clear minefields while being shelled, and maintain roads that infantry and armour depended upon for survival. In the European theatre, engineer casualties were exceeded only by infantry and armour units. The men of the 249th knew this. They had trained for it, and they accepted it as the price of ending the war. The battalion's first major operation came during the Battle of the Bulge. On December 18, 1944, while building a bridge across the Saar River, they received urgent orders to move north. The German offensive in the Ardennes had smashed through American lines, threatening to split the Allied armies and potentially reverse the entire strategic situation in Western Europe. The 249th was assigned to the 26th Infantry Division, tasked with blocking German advances by deploying landmines, establishing obstacles, and creating roadblocks. On Christmas Eve, Brigadier General Harlan Harkness ordered Companies A and C to advance and secure the towns of Arsdorf and Bigonville. For 2 days, combat engineers fought as infantry in brutal close-quarters combat against German defenders who should have been miles away by then. The engineers held. The German advance stalled. The Battle of the Bulge marked the last major German offensive of the war. By March 1945, the strategic situation had transformed completely. The German armies that had nearly broken through at the Bulge were now in full retreat. Soviet forces were approaching Berlin from the east. Allied bombers were systematically destroying what remained of German industrial capacity. But one obstacle remained: the Rhine River. The Rhine had been a barrier throughout European history. In Roman times, it marked the easternmost extent of imperial control. The legions built fortifications along its western bank, but never successfully conquered the territories beyond. In countless wars since, the Rhine had stopped armies, divided kingdoms, and determined the fate of empires. In 1945, it represented something even more significant to the Germans: the last natural defense of the fatherland itself. Once the Allies crossed the Rhine in force, German defeat became not merely likely but mathematically certain. American military planners understood this. So did the Germans. That was why every bridge across the Rhine had been wired with demolition charges. Every crossing point was defended. Every approach was covered by artillery. The Germans could not stop the Allies from reaching the Rhine, but they believed they could stop them from crossing it. And if they could hold the Rhine for weeks, or even months, they might force a negotiated peace that would preserve some semblance of German territorial integrity and spare the fatherland from total occupation. This strategic calculus changed dramatically on March 7, 1945, when elements of the 9th Armoured Division captured the Ludendorff Bridge at Remagen before German engineers could fully destroy it. For the first time since Napoleon's campaigns, an intact bridge stood across the Rhine. Within days, over 125,000 American troops crossed at Remagen, establishing a bridgehead 6 divisions strong. German High Command ordered immediate counterattacks. They failed. Hitler personally demanded that the bridgehead be eliminated. It could not be done. By mid-March, it was clear that the Allies would cross the Rhine in multiple locations, and the question was no longer if Germany would fall, but how quickly. General Omar Bradley, commanding the 12th Army Group, saw the opportunity. His forces, consisting of Lieutenant General Courtney Hodges' 1st Army and General George Patton's 3rd Army, had been advancing rapidly through western Germany, crossing rivers that had stopped armies for centuries. The Erft, the Ruhr, the Moselle, the Main. Each crossing had been contested, each had been won. Now they stood on the west bank of the Rhine, and Bradley issued orders that would define Patton's legacy. Take the Rhine on the run. Patton, 60 years old and the most aggressive commander in the American army, needed no encouragement. He had been racing his rival Montgomery to the Rhine since the breakout from Normandy 9 months earlier. Montgomery represented everything Patton despised: caution, methodical planning, slow advances that minimized casualties but prolonged the war. Patton believed in speed, in violence of action, in maintaining relentless pressure that gave the enemy no time to recover or reorganize. He believed that hesitation cost more lives than boldness, because hesitation gave the enemy time to prepare defenses, bring up reinforcements, and dig in for prolonged resistance. Every day the war continued. Men died. Every week wasted meant another week of V-2 rockets falling on London, another week of concentration camps operating, another week of German cities being incinerated by strategic bombing. The fastest way to end the war was to break the enemy's will to resist, and the way to do that was to cross the Rhine before they expected it, before they were ready, before they could establish the kind of layered defences that would turn the river into another western front. On March 21st, Patton arrived on the west bank of the Rhine near Oppenheim, south of Mainz. He studied the river through binoculars. It was nearly 300 meters wide at this point, flowing swiftly, deep enough to handle commercial barge traffic. The far bank rose gently from the water, covered with trees and buildings that could hide German observation posts and artillery. The town of Nierstein on the far shore appeared quiet, too quiet. Either the Germans had withdrawn, or they were waiting in ambush. There was only one way to find out. Patton selected Major General Leroy Irwin's 5th Infantry Division to spearhead the crossing. The 5th, known as the Red Diamond Division, had distinguished itself repeatedly since landing in Normandy. They had crossed the Sauer, the Kill, and the Moselle under fire. They had smashed through the Siegfried Line. They were veterans who knew how to move fast, hit hard, and exploit success before the enemy could react. Patton's instructions were characteristically direct. Cross tonight, establish a bridgehead, and prepare for the engineers to build a bridge as quickly as possible. The crossing began at 10 o'clock on the night of March 22nd. Assault boats carrying infantry from the 5th Division's 11th Infantry Regiment slipped into the black water, motors muted, men crouching low to avoid presenting silhouettes. The far bank remained silent. The boats touched shore. Infantry scrambled up the bank, weapons ready. Still no fire. The Germans, focused on defending against Montgomery's anticipated crossing to the north, had left Oppenheim lightly defended. Within an hour, an entire infantry regiment was across. Now came the hard part. Infantry could cross in assault boats. Artillery, tanks, and supply trucks could not. For Patton's Third Army to exploit the crossing, they needed a bridge capable of carrying 40-ton Sherman tanks, and they needed it immediately. Before the Germans realized what was happening, before reinforcements arrived, before artillery could zero in on the crossing site, they needed the bridge built not in days, but in hours. At 10:30 that night, 3 miles downstream at Nierstein, Colonel John K. Addison gave the order his men had been waiting for. The 249th Engineer Combat Battalion, along with support units from the 1137th Engineer Combat Group, began moving forward. 25 2.5-ton GMC trucks rolled toward the riverbank, each loaded with components of an M2 treadway bridge. This was the moment they had trained for since February. This was why they had spent weeks in Trier, France, learning to assemble Bailey bridges. This was why they had survived the Battle of the Bulge. Everything they had done for the past 9 months had been preparation for this night. The M2 treadway bridge was, in 1945, the most sophisticated floating bridge system in the world. Each bridge section consisted of steel treadways, 13 feet wide, supported by massive pneumatic floats 33 feet long, 8 feet wide, and 33 inches high when fully inflated. The floats were made of rubberized canvas and weighed 1,000 pounds each when deflated and rolled up. Inflated, they could support tremendous weight. The steel treadways connected to the floats through saddles, creating a continuous roadway that could carry vehicles up to 40 tons. The entire system was modular, designed to be transported on specially modified Brockway B666 6x6 trucks equipped with hydraulic cranes for rapid unloading. The theory was elegant. The reality was brutal. To build a pontoon bridge across 366 meters of river flowing at 7 miles per hour, engineers had to work from boats, often in complete darkness, connecting sections while fighting current and wind. Each float had to be anchored upstream and downstream to prevent the bridge from shifting. The anchors, weighing 100 to 200 pounds each, had to be positioned precisely. The steel saddles connecting floats to treadways had to be pinned securely. Any mistake, any component failure, any section that broke loose would compromise the entire structure. And all of this had to be done while knowing that at any moment, German artillery could begin targeting the construction site, turning the river into a killing ground. Lieutenant Shelato, standing on the riverbank at Nierstein as the first trucks arrived, felt the weight of what was about to begin. He was 24 years old. Many of the men under his command were younger. They were exhausted from months of continuous operations, having slept in foxholes and abandoned buildings, having eaten cold rations and drunk water purified with tablets that made it taste like chemicals. They had seen friends killed and wounded. They had learned to sleep through artillery fire and wake instantly at the sound of small arms. They had become veterans in the hardest school imaginable, and now they were being asked to perform an engineering feat that doctrine said would take at least 24 hours, possibly 48, while General Patton expected them to have it done by morning. The work began at 11 o'clock on the night of March 22nd. The first floats were unrolled and inflated using portable compressors mounted on GMC trucks. The compressors, manufactured by the Leroy Company of Milwaukee, could inflate a 33-foot float in under 10 minutes. While floats inflated, other crews prepared the steel treadways and saddles. The Brockway Bridge erector trucks, modified with hydraulic hoists designed by the Daybrook Corporation, could lift two 15-foot treadway sections simultaneously and drop them into position in 90 seconds. Speed was everything. Every minute saved was a minute less exposure to potential German fire. Every hour gained was an hour closer to getting tanks across before the Germans could mount an effective counterattack. The first section went into the water at 11:15. Engineers working from power utility boats positioned it near the west bank, securing upstream and downstream anchors to keep it from drifting. The second section followed, then the third. The bridge grew incrementally, extending from the western shore like a steel finger reaching across the dark water. By midnight, over 60 feet of bridge stretched into the Rhine. The men worked in near silence, using hand signals and whispered commands, knowing that sound carried across water and that German positions might be listening. At 1 o'clock in the morning, disaster nearly struck. A utility boat positioning a float section miscalculated in the darkness, and the float broke loose, beginning to drift downstream. If it had been lost, the entire construction schedule would have been compromised. Engineers dove into the frigid Rhine water, swimming after the float, fighting current and exhaustion to bring it back under control. It took 20 minutes to secure the section and resume work, 20 minutes that felt like hours to the men on shore watching, knowing that their comrades were in the water, knowing that if German artillery opened up now, those men would have no cover, no protection, nothing but black water and white death. The float was recovered. The bridge continued to grow. By 2 o'clock, they were a quarter of the way across. By 3:30, halfway. The work was back-breaking, repetitive, dangerous. Unroll float, inflate float, position float, anchor float, connect saddle, attach treadway, pin connections, move to next section, repeat. Again and again and again, while the Rhine flowed past, while the night wore on, while every man wondered if the next minute would bring the scream of incoming shells. The Rhine itself was an adversary, as formidable as any German unit. The current pulled at the floats, stressing the connections. The river depth varied, requiring constant adjustment of anchor positions. The wind, picking up as night progressed toward dawn, created waves that made working from utility boats even more difficult, and the water itself was cold enough to induce hypothermia in minutes. Men who fell in had to be pulled out immediately, or risk dying not from enemy action but from exposure. By 5 o'clock in the morning, March 23rd, the bridge was 3/4 complete. Dawn was approaching. With daylight would come visibility, and with visibility would come German artillery, German air attacks, German recognition of what was happening, and German determination to stop it. The engineers worked faster, knowing that time was running out, knowing that once the sun rose, their relatively safe period of construction in darkness would end. At 6:30, the eastern end of the bridge touched the far shore. 366 meters of floating steel now connected Nierstein to the east bank of the Rhine. Engineers scrambled to secure the landing, building approach ramps, positioning guards, preparing for the traffic that would soon follow. The bridge was complete, but it was not yet tested. No one knew if it would actually support the weight of a Sherman tank. No one knew if the German calculations about its structural integrity had been correct. There was only one way to find out. At 7:45 on the morning of March 23rd, 1945, 18 hours after construction began, the first vehicle crossed the Rhine at Nierstein. It was a jeep, light and maneuverable, testing the bridge's basic soundness. The bridge held. Next came a truck, then a heavier truck. Then, at 8:15, a 40-ton Sherman tank rolled onto the western approach, its weight making the treadway groan and flex, its treads gripping the steel surface, its mass supported by the pneumatic floats and the river itself. The tank moved slowly, steadily, inexorably forward. The bridge held. The Sherman reached the far shore. The first American tank had crossed the Rhine since Napoleon's campaigns over a century before. Within an hour, an entire tank battalion was crossing. By noon, 2 complete infantry divisions and supporting artillery were on the east bank. By evening, over 3,000 vehicles had used the bridge. The crossing that German planners thought would require a weeks-long siege had been accomplished in a single night. The barrier that had stopped armies for 2,000 years had been breached in 18 hours by 300 engineers working in darkness with steel and rubber and determination. General Patton arrived at the bridge at 10 o'clock on the morning of March 23rd. He had telephoned Omar Bradley the night before, asking him to keep the crossing secret until it was fait accompli. "I want the world to know 3rd Army made it before Monty starts across," Patton had said. Now, with the bridge operational and thousands of vehicles pouring across, Patton walked to the middle of the structure, stopped, looked around at the Rhine, at the bridge, at the far shore that was now American territory. He unzipped his fly and urinated into the river, while a photographer recorded the moment. Later that day, Patton sent a message to Supreme Headquarters. "Dear Chafe, I have just pissed into the Rhine River. For God's sake, send some gasoline." The gesture was vintage, Patton, combining vulgarity with symbolism, calculated insult with genuine tactical insight. He was marking his territory. He was showing contempt for the barrier that had stopped so many armies. And he was making a point that would resonate with soldiers throughout the 3rd Army. "We have crossed the last obstacle. We are now in Germany proper. The end is in sight." But behind Patton's theatrical display lay a more profound truth. The 249th Engineer Combat Battalion had accomplished something that military doctrine said was nearly impossible. Standard Army field manuals stated that building a 366-metre pontoon bridge would require 24 hours under optimal conditions, 48 hours under combat conditions. The engineers at Nierstein had done it in 18, under darkness, under pressure, knowing that German artillery could begin targeting them at any moment. They had used 93 pneumatic floats and over 1,100 feet of steel treadway. They had positioned over 200 anchors in darkness, working from utility boats on a river flowing at 7 miles per hour. They had done all this without losing a single man to enemy fire, though 1 engineer was killed and 30 wounded when an accident during construction caused a raft to sink. The accomplishment at Nierstein was not isolated. That same day, March 23rd, British and Canadian forces under Montgomery began Operation Plunder, the carefully planned assault crossing of the Rhine at Wesel and Ries. This operation, involving over 1 million troops, 5,000 artillery pieces, and the largest airborne assault since D-Day, represented everything Montgomery stood for: meticulous planning, overwhelming force, minimized risk. The crossing succeeded, but it was expensive, slow, and exactly what the Germans expected. Patton's crossing, by contrast, had been fast, economical, and completely unexpected. It proved that speed and audacity could accomplish what careful planning might not. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. The consequences of the Rhine crossing unfolded rapidly. Within 2 days, the 3rd Army's bridgehead was 35 miles wide and 20 miles deep. Within a week, over 60,000 German soldiers had been captured. The German defensive strategy, based on holding river lines and trading space for time, collapsed completely. There were no more rivers to defend, no more natural barriers, no more fallback positions. The road to Berlin lay open, and though American forces would stop at the Elbe River per agreements with the Soviet Union, the psychological and military impact of crossing the Rhine was immediate and devastating to German morale. In practical terms, the pontoon bridge at Nierstein enabled one of the fastest advances in military history. In the 2 weeks following the crossing, the 3rd Army brought over 60,000 military vehicles across the Rhine. Entire armoured divisions poured into Germany's heartland. German resistance, though fierce in isolated pockets, could not establish a coherent defensive line. Cities that might have resisted for weeks surrendered after token opposition. The German army, which had fought the Soviet Union to a standstill at Moscow and Stalingrad, which had held the Western Allies in the bocage for weeks, which had nearly broken through at the Bulge, simply disintegrated, not because German soldiers suddenly became cowards, but because they recognized military reality. The war was lost. Continuing to fight only prolonged suffering. The strategic impact went beyond mere tactical success. The crossing at Oppenheim and Nierstein demonstrated capabilities that would reshape military engineering for decades. Before March 1945, military planners assumed that major river crossings required weeks of preparation, massive engineering resources, and acceptance of high casualties. The experience at Nierstein proved otherwise. With proper training, adequate equipment, and competent leadership, combat engineers could build bridges capable of supporting armor in less than 24 hours, even under combat conditions. This realization changed how armies thought about mobility and maneuver. Rivers were no longer insurmountable obstacles requiring months of preparation to cross. They were temporary delays that could be overcome in hours. The technology that made this possible was not exotic or particularly advanced. The M2 treadway bridge used pneumatic floats made of rubberized canvas, steel treadways fabricated from standard angles, and pins to connect components. The trucks carrying the equipment were commercial vehicles modified with hydraulic cranes. The compressors inflating the floats were off-the-shelf industrial models. There was nothing about the M2 bridge system that required cutting-edge science or revolutionary engineering. What made it effective was not technological sophistication, but practical design. Components light enough to transport easily, strong enough to carry heavy vehicles, simple enough to assemble in darkness by soldiers working under stress. The same principle that had made the Bailey Bridge so successful, standardized modular components that could be manufactured by multiple contractors and assembled by trained soldiers, made the M2 treadway bridge the most effective tactical bridging system of World War II. The men who built the bridge at Nierstein were not elite specialists. They were not Olympic athletes or MIT-trained engineers. They were ordinary American soldiers, most in their early 20s, who had been trained to do a specific job and did it under extraordinary circumstances. Lieutenant Robert Shalato, who would later attend the memorial dedication 72 years after the crossing, described the experience in simple terms. "We knew General Patton was depending on us. We knew thousands of soldiers were waiting to cross. We knew every hour we saved was lives saved, so we worked." That understated professionalism, the quiet competence of soldiers who understood their role in a larger operation and executed it without drama or complaint, characterized the American military effort in World War II. Millions of men and women, most of them civilians in uniform, performing specialized tasks that collectively added up to victory. The German response to the crossing revealed the deteriorating state of Wehrmacht command and control. When German forces finally recognized what was happening at Oppenheim, Hitler personally ordered immediate counterattacks to destroy the bridgehead. But there were no reserve forces available. The best German divisions had been destroyed in the Bulge, in the Falaise Gap, in Italy, on the Eastern Front. What remained were undertrained Volkssturm units, teenage boys and old men armed with obsolete weapons and motivated primarily by fear of punishment for desertion. These forces launched several attacks against the American bridgehead, but they were uncoordinated, poorly supported, and easily repulsed. German artillery did target the bridges, but American counter-battery fire suppressed most German guns within hours. German aircraft attempted strikes, but Allied air superiority was so complete that Luftwaffe pilots who did attempt missions had life expectancies measured in missions, not months. The strategic situation Germany faced by late March 1945 was hopeless. Soviet forces were within 50 miles of Berlin, advancing from the east with over 2 million troops. Allied strategic bombers had reduced German cities to rubble and destroyed much of Germany's industrial capacity. The Atlantic Wall had been breached. France had been liberated. The Low Countries were free. The Rhine had been crossed in multiple locations. Germany's allies had either surrendered, changed sides, or been occupied. Fuel shortages grounded most German aircraft and immobilized mechanized units. Food shortages threatened civilian starvation. And now American armor was racing across Germany with no natural barriers to stop them. Yet the war continued for another 6 weeks. German forces fought on, sometimes fanatically, often courageously, always hopelessly. They fought because they had been ordered to fight, because they feared Soviet retribution, because Nazi propaganda had convinced them that surrender meant extermination, because some still believed in Hitler, because military discipline held despite everything. The human cost of those final 6 weeks was staggering. Tens of thousands of German soldiers killed, hundreds of thousands captured, thousands of civilians killed in the fighting, cities destroyed, infrastructure wrecked. Suffering that accomplished nothing except to delay inevitable defeat by a few weeks. The bridge at Nierstein, operational for less than a month before being replaced by more permanent structures, carried the vehicles and soldiers who ended that suffering. The 4th Armoured Division, one of Patton's elite units, crossed at Nierstein and raced eastward, capturing hundreds of towns and thousands of prisoners. The 90th Infantry Division followed, then the 6th Armoured Division. Unit after unit, day after day, the bridge at Nierstein served as the gateway through which American combat power flowed into Germany's heartland. By mid-April, advanced American units had reached the Elbe River, over 200 miles east of the Rhine. They stopped there, per agreements reached between Roosevelt, Churchill, and Stalin at Yalta. Berlin would be taken by Soviet forces. The final battle of World War II in Europe would be fought by the Red Army. But the advance that made that final battle possible began at Nierstein on the night of March 22, 1945, when 300 American engineers built a bridge in 18 hours that everyone said would take 2 days. The legacy of that night's work extends far, beyond World War II. The M2 treadway bridge system influenced all subsequent American military bridging. Modern ribbon bridges, tank-launched assault bridges, and air-portable ferries all reflect principles pioneered by the engineers who designed and built the M2 system. The emphasis on modular components, rapid deployment, and soldier-operated systems rather than specialist-dependent equipment became fundamental to American military engineering. The experience of crossing the Rhine demonstrated that mobility and speed could be achieved even when facing major obstacles, provided engineers had adequate training and equipment. The 249th Engineer Combat Battalion, after securing the Rhine bridges in March 1945, continued operations until VE Day. They built bridges across the Isar River, the Inn River, and numerous smaller waterways as Allied forces drove deeper into Germany and Austria. When the war ended in May, they were in Plattling, Germany, where they built a camp for displaced refugees. In November 1945, they returned to the United States, the unit deactivating at Camp Patrick Henry, Virginia, on November 27th. Most of the soldiers returned to civilian life, to jobs and families and the ordinary peacetime existence they had fought to preserve. Few spoke much about what they had done. Like most combat veterans, they understood that people who had not been there could not truly comprehend what it had been like, and they saw no point in trying to explain the unexplainable. But history remembered. Military historians studying the European campaign recognized the Rhine crossing as a pivotal moment. General Eisenhower, in his post-war writings, ranked the Bailey Bridge, and by extension the entire family of American tactical bridging systems, as one of the 3 most important technological developments that shortened the war, alongside radar and the heavy bomber. Without the ability to cross rivers quickly, the rapid advance from Normandy to the Elbe would have been impossible. Every major river would have become a weeks-long siege. Every crossing would have cost thousands of casualties. The war that ended in May 1945 might have continued through summer and possibly into another winter. The human cost of that extended timeline is incalculable, but certainly would have numbered in the hundreds of thousands. The monument dedicated at Nierstein in March 2017, on the 72nd anniversary of the crossing, bears an inscription that captures the essence of what happened there. This remarkable engineering accomplishment undoubtedly contributed to the shortening of the war, thus saving countless lives on both sides of the conflict. That phrase, "both sides," reflects a mature understanding of what war costs. The German soldiers who surrendered to advancing American forces rather than dying in futile last stands benefited from the speed of the American advance. The German civilians who were spared weeks of additional fighting benefited. Even German cities that were captured quickly rather than destroyed in prolonged sieges benefited. War is terrible not because one side suffers, but because all sides suffer, and anything that shortens war reduces that suffering. Robert Shillito, attending the monument dedication at age 92, told the crowd about working in darkness, about the cold river, about the fear of German artillery that never came, about the satisfaction of watching the first tank cross at dawn. He spoke plainly, without false modesty but without boasting, describing what he and his comrades had done as simply doing their jobs. That modesty characterized his generation. They had saved the world from fascism, preserved democracy, and liberated a continent, and they thought of it as just what needed to be done. They did not expect parades or monuments or elaborate thank you ceremonies. They expected to go home, get back to work, and build the peace they had fought for. The 249th Engineer Battalion, reformed in 1994 as a prime power unit providing electrical generation for military operations and disaster relief, continued the tradition of engineering excellence established at Nierstein. Modern soldiers of the 249th deployed to Iraq, Afghanistan, Romania, and disaster zones throughout the United States, providing critical infrastructure support. They served in New York after 9/11, in New Orleans after Katrina, in territories damaged by hurricanes and floods. They carried on the legacy of the men who built bridges under fire in 1945, applying engineering skills to solve problems that threatened lives and missions. The connection between combat engineering in World War II and modern military operations is direct and significant. Every advance requires engineers to clear obstacles, build bridges, repair roads, and establish infrastructure that enables combat forces to operate. The engineers who crossed the Rhine in March 1945 established standards of speed, efficiency, and competence that modern military engineers strive to match. When contemporary American forces conduct river crossings in training or combat, they study the Nierstein crossing as an example of how to do it right. Careful preparation, competent execution, speed that minimizes exposure, and leadership that understands both the technical requirements and the human dimensions of the mission. The story of the Nierstein crossing is ultimately about competence under pressure. It is about soldiers who trained hard, prepared thoroughly, and executed flawlessly when it mattered most. It is about leaders who understood that speed saves lives and who pushed their men to work faster without pushing them beyond their capabilities. It is about equipment designed by engineers who understood that sophisticated technology matters less than reliable performance. And it is about an army that valued results over credentials, that listened to ideas from any source, and that recognized that in war, the weapon that solves the problem is the best weapon, regardless of how simple or sophisticated it might be. General Patton understood this. He knew that the bridge at Nierstein was not built by West Point engineers with advanced degrees. It was built by sergeants and corporals and privates who had learned their trade in training camps and perfected it under fire. He knew that the truck drivers who transported the bridge components, the boat crews who positioned the floats, the officers who coordinated the work were all ordinary Americans doing extraordinary things because that was what the mission required. And he knew that their success demonstrated something fundamental about American military effectiveness. When American soldiers are properly trained, adequately equipped, and competently led, they can accomplish things that seem impossible. The Germans, despite their military proficiency and technological sophistication, never developed a comparable rapid bridge capability. German engineers built excellent permanent bridges, but they never mastered the art of quick tactical bridging that characterized American operations. This was partly a matter of doctrine. German military thinking emphasized fixed defenses and prepared positions rather than rapid maneuver. It was partly a matter of industrial capacity. Germany could not produce the quantities of specialized equipment that American industry delivered, and it was partly a matter of philosophy. German military culture valued specialist expertise, where American culture valued practical competence. An American Combat Engineer Battalion could build a bridge because every soldier in the unit had been trained to perform multiple tasks. A German engineer unit often required specialists for each phase of construction, making them less flexible and adaptable. That flexibility, that adaptability, that fundamental belief that any problem could be solved if you thought about it clearly and were willing to improvise with available materials, characterized American military operations throughout World War II. It was the same spirit that led Sergeant Curtis Coolin to invent the Rhino tank attachment that broke the Normandy stalemate. It was the same spirit that led American industrial workers to produce Sherman tanks, Liberty ships, and B-17 bombers in quantities that overwhelmed Axis production. It was the same spirit that led American soldiers from Utah Beach to the Elbe River in 11 months, liberating millions and ending the most destructive war in human history. The bridge at Nierstein stands as a symbol of that spirit. Simple steel treadways supported by rubberized canvas floats, assembled by young men in darkness, holding together long enough to carry an army across the last barrier between civilization and Nazi tyranny. Nothing about it was elegant or sophisticated or technologically advanced. It was just good enough to do the job that needed doing. And sometimes, that is all that matters. Sometimes the most important innovations are not the ones that push the boundaries of what is theoretically possible, but the ones that solve the immediate practical problem in front of you. 75 years after the Rhine crossing, as the last veterans of World War II pass away, the story of what happened at Nierstein becomes more important, not less. It reminds us that ordinary people, facing extraordinary challenges, are capable of extraordinary achievements. It reminds us that courage is not the absence of fear, but the decision to do what needs to be done, despite fear. It reminds us that competence matters, that training matters, that leadership matters, and that soldiers who know their jobs and do them well can change the course of history. The engineers who built the Nierstein Bridge in 18 hours did not set out to become heroes. They set out to do their jobs. But in doing those jobs, they shortened a war, saved lives, and helped free a continent. That is heroism of a particular American kind. Quiet, competent, practical, unadorned by rhetoric or ceremony. Just men doing hard work under difficult circumstances because it needed to be done. That is worth remembering. That is worth honoring. That is why monuments stand at Nierstein, commemorating not just what happened there, but what it represents about human capability and determination, and the power of ordinary people to achieve extraordinary results. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe. The Rhine crossing at Nierstein was not an isolated miracle. It was the culmination of lessons learned across 9 months of continuous combat operations in Europe. The 249th Engineer Combat Battalion had built bridges across the Saar River under artillery fire. They had cleared minefields in the Ardennes while German infantry probed their positions. They had repaired roads destroyed by retreating Wehrmacht forces, working through nights to keep supply lines open. Every bridge, every road, every obstacle cleared had taught them something about working faster, more efficiently, under worse conditions. The training they received in October and November 1944 at Trier, France, had been crucial. For weeks, they practiced assembling Bailey bridges repeatedly, learning not just the mechanics but developing the muscle memory that allowed them to work by touch in darkness. They learned to anticipate problems before they occurred, to position equipment for maximum efficiency, to work as coordinated teams rather than collections of individuals. That training transformed a competent engineer battalion into an elite unit capable of performing under the extreme pressure of crossing the Rhine under Patton's demanding timeline. The lesson of Nierstein was simple but profound. Preparation enables performance. The 18-hour bridge construction was not a lucky accident or the result of superhuman effort. It was the predictable outcome of proper training, adequate equipment, competent leadership, and soldiers who understood their mission and committed themselves to accomplishing it. There was nothing magical about what the 249th accomplished. They simply did what they had been trained to do, under circumstances that tested that training to its limit. This principle applies far beyond military engineering. In any field, sustained excellence requires preparation that seems excessive until the moment it becomes essential. The hours spent training in Trier seemed repetitive and tedious to many soldiers at the time, but those hours made the difference between success and failure at Nierstein. The engineers who could assemble bridge components by touch in darkness, who could position floats accurately despite current and wind, who could maintain their composure under pressure, were the engineers who had done it dozens of times in training. Excellence under pressure is never accidental. It is always the result of preparation that precedes pressure. The strategic context of March 1945 made the Nierstein crossing particularly significant. Germany's military situation was desperate but not yet hopeless. If the Wehrmacht could hold the Rhine for weeks, or even months, if they could force the Allies into costly, protracted river crossings at multiple points, they might create conditions for a negotiated peace that preserved something of German sovereignty. Every day the Rhine remained a barrier was a day German leadership could use to attempt diplomatic solutions or reorganize shattered forces. The rapid crossing at Nierstein, followed immediately by massive reinforcement of the bridgehead, eliminated that possibility. Once American armor was across in force, German defeat became a matter of weeks, not months. The human cost of this speed was measured not in American casualties, which were remarkably light at Nierstein, but in lives saved by shortening the war. Every week the war continued cost tens of thousands of lives on all sides. Allied soldiers killed in combat, German soldiers killed defending hopeless positions, civilians killed in bombing raids, artillery strikes, and ground combat. Concentration camp prisoners murdered in the final weeks of Nazi atrocities. The advance that began at Nierstein brought forward the end by weeks, perhaps months. The lives saved by that acceleration number in the tens of thousands, possibly hundreds of thousands. The physical bridge at Nierstein served for only a few weeks before being replaced by more substantial structures. By April 1945, permanent bridges were being constructed across the Rhine at multiple points. The M2 treadway bridge was dismantled. Its components moved forward to bridge other rivers as American forces advanced deeper into Germany. But the impact of what happened there on March 22nd and 23rd endured. It demonstrated that the Rhine was not an insurmountable obstacle. It proved that rapid river crossings were possible with existing technology and trained personnel. It showed that speed and audacity could accomplish what methodical planning might not. Field Marshal Montgomery's Operation Plunder, launched the day after Patton's crossing, was a masterpiece of careful military planning. It involved over 1 million troops, massive preliminary bombardment, and an airborne assault involving 2 divisions dropped behind German lines. It succeeded, establishing a bridgehead that eventually funneled British and Canadian forces into northern Germany. But it was also slow, expensive, and exactly what German commanders expected. Patton's crossing was everything Montgomery's was not. Fast, economical, unexpected, and disproportionately effective relative to resources committed. Both approaches worked. But Patton's approach demonstrated principles that would influence American military doctrine for decades: speed, surprise, and acceptance of risk in pursuit of decisive results. The engineers who made that speed possible never claimed credit for winning the war. They understood their role as supporting the infantry and armor that did the fighting. But without their bridge, those combat forces could not have crossed. Without their competence, the crossing would have taken days instead of hours. Without their courage, working in darkness, knowing that German artillery could target them at any moment, the entire operation might have failed. Support troops do not receive the same recognition as combat troops, but modern military operations are impossible without them. Every tank requires fuel, ammunition, and maintenance. Every infantry advance requires supplies, medical support, and engineering to clear obstacles. The soldiers who provide those services enable everything else that happens in war. The story of the Nierstein crossing is also a story about leadership at multiple levels. General Patton's decision to cross the Rhine quickly, before the Germans fully recognized the opportunity, demonstrated strategic vision. Major General Manton Eddy's careful positioning of 12 Corps to support the crossing showed operational competence. Colonel Alfred Starbird's coordination of multiple engineer units reflected excellent staff work. Colonel John K. Addison's leadership of the 249th maintained unit cohesion under extreme pressure. Lieutenant Shalato's supervision of bridge construction combined technical knowledge with practical judgment. And every sergeant and corporal leading small teams of engineers contributed leadership at the point of execution. That distributed leadership, with competent officers and NCOs at every level making good decisions within their areas of responsibility, characterized effective American military operations throughout World War II. The American military did not rely on brilliant generals issuing orders that subordinates executed mechanically. It relied on competent leaders at every level, understanding the commander's intent and making appropriate decisions to achieve that intent. This approach required more training, more education, and more trust in subordinates than authoritarian military systems, but it proved remarkably effective in the fluid, chaotic environment of modern warfare. The Rhine crossing demonstrated another crucial principle: the importance of combining different military capabilities in coordinated operations. Infantry secured the initial foothold. Engineers built the bridge. Artillery suppressed German counterfire. Air forces provided cover and struck German reinforcements. Supply troops ensured that bridge-building materials arrived on time. Medical personnel established aid stations for casualties. Military police directed traffic crossing the bridge. Every branch of service contributed to the operation's success. This combined arms approach, integrating capabilities from across the military, became fundamental to American military doctrine and remains central to how American forces operate today. 79 years after the Nierstein crossing, few veterans of that operation survive. Robert Shalato, who attended the memorial dedication in 2017, passed away several years later. The soldiers who built the bridge in 18 hours, who inflated pontoons in darkness, who fought Rhine current to position floats, who risked their lives to accomplish a mission their general said was critical, are nearly all gone. But what they accomplished endures. The principles they demonstrated: preparation enables performance, competence matters, speed saves lives, ordinary people can achieve extraordinary results, remain relevant. The monument at Nierstein stands not as a celebration of war, but as a reminder of what free people can accomplish when defending their civilization against tyranny. The engineers who built that bridge were not professional soldiers. They were citizens in uniform, mechanics and farmers and teachers who had learned military skills because their country needed them. When the war ended, they returned to civilian life, building the post-war prosperity that vindicated everything they had fought for. That civilian soldier tradition, the idea that free citizens can become effective warriors when necessary and return to productive civilian life when danger passes, distinguishes democratic societies from militaristic ones. The bridge built at Nierstein in March 1945 carried more than tanks and trucks. It carried the hopes of millions suffering under Nazi oppression. It carried the determination of democratic nations to defeat fascism. It carried the accumulated industrial might of American factories and the agricultural bounty of American farms. It carried forward the momentum that would end the most destructive war in human history. And it was built in 18 hours by 300 ordinary Americans who understood that their work mattered, who committed themselves to excellence, and who refused to accept that the impossible could not be done. That is the legacy of Nierstein. That is why it deserves to be remembered. Not because bridges are particularly interesting in themselves, but because this bridge represented something larger: the triumph of democratic competence over authoritarian brutality, the victory of practical problem-solving over ideological rigidity, the success of free people defending their civilization. In the end, that was what World War II was about. And that was what the engineers at Nierstein helped accomplish when they built their bridge across the Rhine in the darkness of March 22, 1945.